In my Center for Public Leadership interview, I was asked, why did you write your essays about restorative justice when all of your work has been in other areas? I said that I believed if we could transform our justice system to be from justice as harming to justice as healing, it would offer paradigm shifts that we could use to create change in other areas. I said it would signal to me that we as a society believe in other humans' potential to change for the better, which would give me hope in humanity. I did not know that my second semester as a Harvard Kennedy School student, my values about justice would be tested when, on a first date, a Harvard law student raped me. I didn't plan to report what had happened at first, but I soon read that 90% of campus rape happens by repeat offenders. And I read studies suggesting that 60% of it could be prevented if people were stopped after their second attempt. I felt that how I responded could impact other people and play a role in whether he did this to others. I also knew that the criminal system wouldn't believe me, and I felt that the campus system would only incentivize him to defend what he did and deny it, rather than my goal, which was for him to understand it and never do it again. So I turned to restorative justice. What is that exactly? Restorative justice is a philosophical value system for responding to harm, which centers repairing harm. Our traditional justice system asks, what law was broken? Who did it? And what should be the punishment? But restorative justice asks, who was harmed? What harms have been created? How can we address needs? What are the responsibilities of the people who have caused harm? And how can we as a community make sure that this never happens again? Restorative justice practices are rooted from indigenous communities like the First Nation peoples in North America, as well as groups in New Zealand. They take a variety of shapes, including restorative justice conferencing between two or more parties, which involves extensive preparation separately ahead of time, and also restorative justice circles, which can involve community members, like bystanders or members of the same residence hall, for example. So that made a ton of sense for me, and that was what I wanted. But I did not know, and this was February 2017, how hard it would be to create a justice process that made so much sense to me at my core. There were three main barriers at that time. The first was finding a facilitator. I scoured the country and had relationships with leaders in the restorative justice movement, but I could only find 2 or 3 people who had the experience and skills to facilitate restorative justice in response to rape. Even within the restorative justice movement, many people had this idea that I will facilitate restorative justice even for murder, but sexual harm crosses a line. There was a sense of a hierarchy of crime, so there wasn't as much experience and training, and I couldn't find someone to do it. The second major challenge was related to federal guidance. Restorative justice and mediation are 2 separate things, but the Obama administration had guidance in 2011 that said that mediation was never appropriate in response to sexual assault, which I agree with. The problem is that universities were conflating those 2 things. So, afraid of violating those federal guidelines, this guidance had a chilling effect across the country where universities wouldn't do restorative justice for assault. And finally, a very important part of restorative justice is that it involves a person who caused harm admitting to that harm and acknowledging what they did instead of denying it. And in our legal system, this poses conflicts because it was not safe for my assailant to admit in a restorative justice process to that harm when there was risk that that could later be used against him in a criminal or other proceeding, which was very challenging. Despite these many barriers, to my surprise, my assailant agreed in an email to participate in a restorative justice process. I found a facilitator willing to do it, even though they'd never done it for this before. They were willing to take a chance. And I was even working with a pro bono law firm I found to draft a confidentiality agreement. But it was unclear whether it would be enforceable. This was also very challenging because at this point it was about 3 weeks before the person who harmed me would graduate from Harvard Law on his way to become a prosecutor for the Department of Justice. And once he got that diploma, my options for reporting would be limited, as opposed to if I had filed a report beforehand, at least his diploma would be delayed and maybe his bar exam could be delayed 6 months. But because this was separate from the university system, I had to make a choice between going through this separate independent restorative justice process and withdrawing my complaint to make it more likely for him to be able to do that versus having this twinge of revenge and being able to report it through the school. There was incomplete information. Harvard law deans lied to me about their processes repeatedly to try to get me to not report. I couldn't reach Harvard Kennedy School about my questions because they said their phones were broken the week before he graduated. It was an extremely stressful time, but I decided to take that risk and choose the restorative justice option because I wanted that so badly that even in the chance it worked out, it was something I really wanted. 2 weeks after graduation, I got the call that he had dropped out of the restorative justice process. My healing would need to be independent from him. At least at that time, I would not get the answers to my questions from him. I would not get the acknowledgement of harm and the understanding that I sought, and I would not have that reconciliation that I dreamed of. But I can't say I blamed him because the infrastructure at that time did not exist to make this feasible and supported in our systems. 3 years later, I recently had a call with one of the leading advocates and researchers for restorative justice for campus sexual assault who had helped me back then. And I asked him, since then, have any universities actually offered restorative justice processes for campus sexual assault? To my surprise, he said yes. University of Michigan alone had over 30 cases for non-consensual penetration just in the past year alone. They just opened their process a year ago, and half of their students are going through it with tremendous satisfaction, healing, transformation. We are seeing pockets of hope. As far as the barriers I talked about, the legal barriers for being able to admit harm, which were so central to my case, we're seeing some interesting changes on. Scholars have recently developed sample memorandums of understanding that a university can enter into with the local district attorney that says that what is said, new information that's brought in a restorative justice process, can't be used in later criminal proceedings, which means that a survivor who wants that option is more likely to be able to have their assailant be able and willing to participate in a process, and the survivor still has the right to later decide if they want to file a criminal report, but that information would not be admissible in it, which is what I had wanted. We're also seeing bold proposals from others that are making the case for a federal evidentiary standard that could achieve a similar goal, which we have in other situations like medical apology laws, plea negotiations, truth and reconciliation committees, and scenarios where we decide the benefit of not making certain information admissible is beneficial enough for other purposes. These kinds of legal mechanisms might have made the difference in whether I had access to that justice 3 years ago. On the facilitation front, we are seeing more trainings happening across the country for people to get facilitation training on these topics, including on college campuses. And there's tremendous interest from many staff members at universities that know the current systems can be incredibly re-traumatizing. But there's still a long way to go for training and understanding. And finally, the federal guidance. Although I vehemently disagree with what most of Betsy DeVos's education administration is doing for campus sexual assault, an interesting development is that this education administration has lifted the restrictions on mediation for campus sexual assault. So to the extent that people were conflating that with restorative justice, many of those restrictions are now lifted, which might open up opportunities. However, on the other side of this, the changes that this administration is making will make the traditional investigation options even more painful, more traumatic, and more torturous for survivors. They're having changes such as survivors having direct cross-examination in hearings and other major challenges, which to me points again to the need for alternative options for people to be able to choose from now more than ever. As somebody who later went through Harvard's Title IX investigation when it was my only other option, I can tell you it is hell. And these changes are only going to make that harder, which means there's even greater need than ever before for alternative options for people to actually find healing and accountability in a new way. My hope is that survivors who experience this after me, and I wish that no one ever had to, but my hope is that for those in that situation, people have opportunities to simply be asked the questions, what do you need? How can we repair harm? And how can we as a community make sure this never happens to you or to anyone else? Those questions extend to so many issues besides responding to sexual assault. As leaders in both our personal lives and our professional work, whether it's responding to a team conflict, addressing a cultural organizational challenge, or even getting through a painful breakup, infidelity, or betrayal, we can ask of ourselves, of one another, what do I need? Or if someone else has been harmed, what do you need? And how can we collectively repair harm?
Thank you for educating so many of us. I am familiar with the issues on campus around this, and I never heard of restorative justice being used for sexual assault. So I have learned something and really appreciate it.